All right. So, all of us are familiar with what an iPhone is. It's a nearly ubiquitous piece of technology in today's modern society. However, how many of you actually know where the money to be spent on an iPhone truly goes? Well, if you're anything like most people, this is probably something of what you would come up with. The majority of the money goes to the United States, who developed the product. Another percentage goes to China, who is the main assembler, and the rest goes to small component manufacturers. However, the reality is quite a different situation. According to Capturing Value in Global Networks, Apple's iPad and iPhone by Kramer, Linden, and Dietrich, 34% of the money you spend on an iPhone goes to Japan. The next largest portion, 17%, goes to Germany, followed by South Korea at 13%. Finally, we get to the US and China, who get about 6% and 3% respectively. The remaining 27% is distributed in small portions around just various other countries who contribute usually either components or labor to the iPhone process. So why am I even talking about iPhones when my speech said free trade on the first slide? Well, clearly from this example, it's easy to see that an iPhone can't even be made without free trade. It's a global effort to produce the product. And that's sort of just what I wanted to start out basing that on. So while free trade has many benefits, which I will cover shortly, it's important to understand that it's not really a guaranteed thing in today's world, especially since the global political meta has been shifting towards being more conservative and nationalistic. Isolationist and protectionist economic policies have been on the rise. As you can see in the graphic, a lot of the most liberal and Western countries are the ones underdoing these protectionist policies. And what is protectionism? Why is this a problem? Well, protectionism in economics means that countries undertake policies that benefit their own native industries at the detriment of any other country trying to do business there. This can take the form of restricted trade, restricted immigration because people are also considered capital, subsidies, tariffs, quotas, or any other measure along those lines. This isn't a good thing because the global economy is set up in such a way that everyone and everyone's economy essentially depends on each other, and upsetting that balance can and will probably have huge negative consequences, not only economically, but also politically and environmentally. Ironically, as I've covered a little bit, most of today's most protectionist countries are those who were most ardently in favor of free trade in the immediately preceding decades. These include the US, the UK, and many other G20 nations. This is most likely tied to the rise of, as I said earlier, conservatism and isolationism, as can be seen with the election of Donald Trump and also the victory of Brexit in the UK. So it's also necessary to note the distinction between free trade as a theory and free trade in its more practical application, which takes the form of free trade areas. As outlined in Free Trade Under Fire, published in 2015, free trade is, in its most basic form, international trade without tariffs or other non-tariff barriers. This means that buyers and sellers within various economies are able to trade with other economies without the domestic governments of either party interfering in that process. So, as I said earlier, it's important to note the distinction between free trade and free trade areas, which are their more practical application. Well, an example of a free trade area would be the North American Free Trade Area, or NAFTA, which is an agreement between Canada, the USA, and Mexico. NAFTA, which instituted free trade concepts by coordinating trade policy between the three states, was able to procure a number of benefits for all parties involved, including quadrupling of trade from just $297 billion to $1.14 trillion, lower tariffs, and increased foreign direct investment, all of which translated to economic growth for each member state, according to Lorenzo Caliendo's estimates of the trade and welfare effects of NAFTA. However, while free trade areas can be beneficial, it's important to keep in mind that this morning, as I'm talking about free trade's benefits, I'm more referring to its more theoretical application and not free trade areas, which are sort of their own monster. So, of all the effects of globally instituted free trade, perhaps the most readily apparent is increased peace between trading partners, which is itself a symptom of economic interdependence. As explained in Free Trade Today, published in 2003, the theory of economic interdependence is, in essence, the idea that trading partner states become inextricably linked, both politically and economically, through prolonged trade. At this point, it becomes economically unfeasible for either state to go to war with the other because both economies are reliant upon the other to continue functioning at a high level. In a sense, economic interdependence creates mutually assured economic destruction, just like actual nuclear missiles create mutually assured just destruction. So, as I said, economic interdependence can cut down on wars between states that are trading together. But why is that actually beneficial? To just sort of illustrate the strict dollar value, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have cost us upwards of around $6 trillion to date. That's kind of an unimaginable figure. It's really hard to even conceptualize what $6 trillion would be. And it's, imagine the money if that had gone anywhere else besides war. The amount of bridges we could have rebuilt, the amount of schools we could have built, the amount of infrastructure we could have fixed within our country. It's a lot of money that is going into essentially what is not really benefiting anyone besides the military-industrial complex. So the effectiveness of economic interdependence in fostering peace can be pretty clearly seen when you compare the raw number of major wars fought from the 19th to the 20th centuries. The 19th century had 17 major wars fought between European states alone, while on the other hand there were only 3 major wars involving European powers in the next century, only one of which occurred after the international establishment of free trade policies, which occurred after the end of the Second World War. As per Douglas Irwin's book, Against the Tide, An Intellectual History of Free Trade, the good news is that as global norms have tended towards free trade policies, economic interdependence between many states has increased dramatically. This effectively means that war is becoming less and less profitable as a means of conflict resolution for a growing number of states, which is almost directly a result of free trade policies. According to the broad and narrow arguments for free trade from 1993, another key aspect of free trade is the concept that along with the free transfer of goods and services across different markets comes the free transfer of ideas and technologies. This, in combination with the transfer of skilled labor between trading partners, creates favorable conditions for less developed states to modernize and improve their existing technological infrastructure. As seen in Paul Krugman's Is Free Trade Passé, those opposed to free trade will argue that while innovation does occur as a result of free trade, it comes at the expense of citizens living in less developed states. However, what they don't tell you is that those poor conditions observed in developing economies are usually the result of domestic policies within those states themselves and not an inherent effect of free trade. Consider, for example, the case of the Northeast Asian states, namely Japan and South Korea, which benefited immensely from a global economy focused on free trade in the years immediately following the Second World War, and were able to completely modernize their economies and successfully transition from developing states into fully developed states in just a matter of years. Compare this to nearly any state in South America, which had all the same advantages as those in Asia and was not ravaged by war, but still to this day has not successfully transitioned into a modernized economy. As explained in Free Trade, Old and New Challenges by Jagdish Bhagwati, both regions have been party to free trade policies, and how those states dictated policy within their own domestic end played the largest role in how free trade affected civilian bodies within the states. It's also important to remember that innovation always comes at some cost, whether that is the marginalization of a demographic or the destruction of an industry that has become obsolete in the face of more advanced technology. As outlined in J. Bhagwati's The Case for Free Trade, often industries opposed to free trade policies fail to see how it could benefit their own interests. In the article, he posits that environmental concerns related to the growth of industry as caused by free trade are often exaggerated, because as prosperity grows, so too does the state's willingness to spend money on conservation. The most basic example of this can be seen in a totally different way, but with Uber and pre-existing taxi services. Although Uber was massively successful and made transport services cheaper and more efficient for customers, at the same time it also displaced several traditional taxi companies and cost many their jobs. However, if innovation is halted to protect the interests of those behind the times, in many cases all parties will be worse off in the long run. So, in closing, it is clear to see the many benefits of free trade for any country in the world. While the general politics around the world have shifted away from free trade, I don't think this is a good thing because free trade makes countries more connected to each other through economic interdependence. It reduces the likelihood of nations going to war with one another, and it helps to drive innovation throughout the world. If the current trend of isolationism and protectionism is continued, we could see a dramatic rollback of several, if not all, of these benefits, as well as a complete collapse of the global economy.